Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the Sheen Center, William Spencer Riley.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Galileo. I don't know of a richer subject when you talk about the intersection of science and religion. This is such a rich subject, which we're going to do a lot of this year. We're actually doing a reading of a new play called Dear Galileo. But I want to let these guys share with you some stuff that I have no doubt in my mind that you're not aware of about this extraordinary human being. Interfaith stuff is really very important to the Sheen Center. When I first took this job, the key word that got me was the word thought, the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. And building bridges of understanding among people of different faiths is really at the core of what I've done for many years, and equally important what the Sheen Center wants to do on an ongoing basis. And when I first met Craig Hatkoff and Rabbi Irwin Kula, I was blown away by not only their knowledge of Galileo and the church's role, but more importantly realized in a minute that this could be a very rich conversation. And speaking of interfaith stuff, for those of you who are interested, on December the 5th, the Sheen Center will be hosting a terrific discussion on the crisis of Christians in the Middle East. It's on our website. I highly recommend it. It's free, actually, but you have to reserve a place. I have no doubt in my mind that as a result of tonight, if you're inspired, you're going to want to come to that. So let me bring out the people who are going to share with you what I think is going to be a special hour and 15 minutes or so. So Craig Hatkoff is the founder of the Tribeca Film Festival, as well as the Disruptor Foundation and annual Tribeca Disruptive Innovative Awards. He serves on the board of the Tribeca Film Festival, the Desmond Tutu Peace Foundation, the Child Mine Institute, Wild Bird Fund, and the Borough of Manhattan Community College. He is currently an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, where he created and teaches the course on disruptive innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Craig Hatkoff. With prop in hand, and I'll let him, I'm not going to steal his thunder about his prop, but Rabbi Irwin Kula is an internationally sought-after speaker. Rabbi Irwin Kula has inspired people worldwide by using Jewish wisdom to speak to all aspects of modern life and relationships. An engaged and thoughtful trader in the global marketplace of ideas, he led a Passover Seder in Bhutan, consulted with government officials in Rwanda, helped build cultural and interfaith bridges in Qatar, and met with leaders as diverse as the Dalai Lama and Queen Noor to discuss compassionate leadership in the 21st century. Please welcome Rabbi Irwin Kula. Thank you. And Irwin is going to be moderating our discussion tonight. Next, from America Magazine, Father Sam Sawyer is a Jesuit priest and the executive editor and director of digital strategy for American Media. Before entering the Society of Jesus, he worked as a software engineer and now manages America Magazine's digital platforms. He also assists on Sunday at the Church of St. Francis Xavier in Manhattan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Father Sam Sawyer, S.J. Sam. Great. And Douglas Bendel is a theologian and Anglican priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Newark. His work is in process theology, cosmology, and theological education. Dr. Bendel is the founder and president of the Newark School of Theology in Newark, New Jersey. His research interests are in the doctrine of God, quantum physics, and theology. Dr. Douglas Bendel. Please welcome Dr. Bendel. Great. Now, what do we got here? So we got a rabbi, a priest, and a minister walk into a theater, and go for it, gents. And lastly, Jacob Haq Misra. Jacob Haq Misra is a research scientist with Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. He holds a PhD in astrobiology and meteorology, and he has published dozens of scholarly journals articles. His research includes the study of climate, extraterrestrial life, and ethics. Please welcome Jacob Haq Misra. Thank you. Welcome, Jacob. We're going to be videotaping this discussion, but I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Rabbi Irwin Kula.
And I turn it right over to Craig.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to start with a little experiment. and it's a little hard to see, but I'm going to ask people to raise their hands, and I'm going to start with a hammer in one hand and a feather in the other. And I'm going to drop them. I may need a little help on the mic. And I want to take a vote in advance which will hit the ground first. The hammer, vote hammer first. Feather. Oh, okay. Welcome to the scientific method. Okay, here, take the mic.
Very good.
Take one. Well, looks like the audience at one level was correct. However, there's a slight problem, and I thought if we could what if we could just magically conjure up the same experiment on the moon? What do you think would happen? Let's take another vote. What would hit the ground first? Hammer or the moon, not the ground? The hammer hit the moon surface first or the feather? Okay, so let's roll the tape. It just so happens NASA took care of this for us. So welcome to Galileo Deconstructed.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
So our first problem for this evening was Mr. Galileo was right, but unfortunately Mr. Aristotle was not correct. And Aristotle had suggested that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. And when you remove air resistance, and we have a panel of PhDs, we may talk about that a little bit later, they actually would hit the ground at the same time. And there's an apocryphal version of Galileo dropping two cannonballs, one small, one large, off the Tower of Pisa to make this demonstration. It didn't happen, but it's a good visual anyway. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Irwin, who's going to frame this evening's conversation.
So Eddie, welcome everybody. Everybody has a sense of what a dominant narrative is, right? You know, that's the sort of narrative that you learn early. It's almost seamless. The narrative of progress, the narrative of American exceptionalism, the Marxist narrative, the free market narrative, the manifest destiny narrative. These are large stories through which we understand who we are as individual human beings, as political systems. And for tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to take one narrative, the narrative of Galileo and the church. And as soon as I say that, I'm sure there's a whole set of immediate pieces of knowledge and feelings and experiences and identifications with either Galileo or the church, or science and religion. What we're going to do tonight is, I mean, the fancy word is we're going to deconstruct it, but it's actually, you don't have to think about it in terms of deconstruction. That sounds so ominous. But simply that it may be more complicated than it looks, those sorts of stories. And that when we actually divide or read the world through that sort of story that becomes so dominant, more often than not, we get ourselves in some problematic situations down the road. So here's what we're going to do tonight. There's 3 jobs to get done. The first job is to literally have us all experience that yikes, or oh my God, depending on whether you're religious or secular. This story is much more complicated than I thought. There's more here than meets the eye. The second job that we're going to get done is, because this is not just an intellectual exercise, we want to reflect a little bit about what the costs of the conventional narrative is. Because there are costs that we pay all the way down to today. And then the third thing, if we get time, and this is really in the interaction between us, is what sorts of very hardened and fixed narratives are actually getting in the way of having conversations, getting in the way of solving, or at least addressing in some sort of constructive way, some of the intractable problems we have? Or how do those narratives or ways in which we're framing things, science versus religion, for example, actually creating some of the polarization that I think we're all feeling as Americans, as people in the West? There's a lot of ways to even frame that. So that's the three jobs, okay? Making the conventional narrative a little more complicated and probably much more interesting. 2, what are the costs of having a narrative that seems so neatly to explain things? And 3, how can we then, using the insights generated by understanding the narrative in a more complicated way, understanding actually that there are costs to pay for these sorts of dominant narratives, what can we learn and take to perhaps address some of the ways that we are so polarized today? Okay? Make sense? So I'm going to introduce Craig, who's going to do the first sort of debunking the conventional narrative. And I'll only say this. They say there's 3 sides to every story. You know, yours, mine, and what really happened. Go, Craig.
So I think most people perceive the traditional narrative of Galileo, and we're going to run a little PowerPoint. This is a 5-minute crash course for purposes of this evening's discussion, 5-minute crash course in the history of the Galileo affair, and we are stripping away a lot. But it really is a story of a conflict between 2 men. On the left, we have Pope Urban VII, formerly known as Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, and on the right, looking up, I'm not sure that was the original pose, but Galileo Galilei, otherwise known as just Galileo. And the traditional narrative is that the big bad church and the nemesis, Pope Urban, persecuted Galileo for his Copernican beliefs and basically threw him to the Inquisition at the end, and that the church did not understand where the center of the universe really was. And so these are our 2 main, let's call them to start, the protagonist Galileo and the antagonist Pope Urban. Now, if we go to the next slide, for purposes of this evening, I'm just going to introduce our cast of characters, because in the real story, there are hundreds. It makes Game of Thrones look like nothing, which I'm still trying to understand. But we just have to have a few characters in mind. So we have Galileo and Pope Urban, the protagonist and the antagonist. And over the course of the conversation, we'll talk about, I'll call them the theologians, scientists / philosophers, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Roberto Bellarmino, and Maffeo Barberini, ultimately Pope Urban. And notice that I mentioned Pope Urban was quite a good scientist. And so with that, we have 3 cosmologies. One was Ptolemy, which placed Earth at the center of the universe. And then in the early 1500s, a fellow by the name of Copernicus tried to understand why we were getting all these anomalies in measuring the skies and making predictions about the solar movements. And what he came up with was, from a mathematical standpoint, it would make a lot more sense if the sun were at the center of the universe. And there was a third system that we don't usually hear about, and we're very fortunate tonight with Jacob, who is an expert on these 3 systems, or at least enough to get us through the evening. And we just know about Ptolemy had the Earth at the center of the universe, and Copernicus had the sun at the center of the universe, and this third system never came up. And having said that, we're going to start deconstructing Galileo. Let's go to the next slide. And so the traditional story is Galileo and Urban, mortal enemies, and it's the big bad backwards church, reviled science, that persecuted Galileo for heresy. And at his trial in 1633, Galileo recants his Copernican beliefs before the Inquisition. He's thrown in prison, dies a blind and broken man. And at the trial, an abjuration of his Copernican beliefs, that's really considered by many as the beginning of the epic conflict between science and religion. So we're going to take another quick look, and this is very oversimplified, but then, so we call this Galileo as Snow White. He's the revered scientist and does nothing wrong. And in truth, we'll go to the next page. I'm going to describe Galileo in this slightly emerging narrative as a little different than Snow White. Let's think of him as Walter White in Breaking Bad. And while Walter White, and for those of you who don't know, I'll give the 30-second explanation. It's one of the great cable shows, Breaking Bad. A high school teacher gets cancer. His medicine won't pay. The medical insurance won't pay. He becomes basically the world's greatest meth dealer and goes a little bit dark on us. Yeah, I guess that's sufficient. I hear enough giggles, so people will know it. And we'll talk about Walter White afterwards. We'll look him up later. But Galileo was a bit of a scoundrel, a bit of a rogue, and very narcissistic. But I think what's really interesting is the perception that the church had no interest in Copernicanism or astronomy, and that this was really just upsetting the natural order of things. But essentially, Galileo, starting in the early 1600s, from 1611 or so, really had some of the most powerful theologians encouraging him to fully explore Copernicanism, as long as he kept it hypothetical and didn't turn it into a matter of faith. And so Roberto Bellarmino, Cardinal Bellarmino, Pope Urban were very interested in Copernicanism, but they wanted to see a proof. And what really got Galileo in deep trouble was by 1632, he published a book, probably one of his two most famous books, and I think, Douglas, you'll talk a little bit about that later, Dialogue of the Two Chief World Systems. The church gave him the imprimatur to publish the book. He dedicated the book to the Pope and presenting the arguments for and against Copernicanism. And two little things happened. This is all we need for this evening. One, he didn't mention the compromise system of the Tychonian model, which would have left the Earth at the center of the universe. And you have to understand, there was no way to prove any of this. And from an observational standpoint, there really was no difference between the Tychonian and the Copernican view. And so what we have to understand also is that Galileo was making a conjecture and never delivered the proof throughout his entire career. So he was proposing that Copernicanism was the dominant theme. The church was looking for the proof, which he never delivered. So what happened also is, in the dialogue, the Pope's own arguments on Copernicanism were placed in the mouth of a character called the Idiot, which did not go over well when Pope Urban was informed that his argument that he personally gave to Galileo was in the character's name is Simplicio, the simpleton, and it was an incredibly bad personal embarrassment to the Pope. Now, where it gets kind of interesting is, as opposed to a conflict between science and religion, in Europe, you have to put this in the context of something called the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. And by 1632, about 8 million people had already died, and it was really a conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics by and large, but it got a lot more complicated. It really wasn't just about the religious conflict. And what we really started to see is that Catholic versus Catholic, the Spanish Habsburgs were fighting with the French, and here's poor Pope Urban trying to keep the balance of power. If people remember balance of power politics, he's trying to mediate between the Catholic French and the Catholic Habsburgs, and along the way, he ended up becoming a little bit more friendly by 1632. He was sort of his allegiance was really to France. He had been one of the emissaries to France, and the Spanish got rather upset about that, and they wanted him deposed. And one of their main reasons for having Pope Urban deposed had to do with the fact that he was being very lenient towards heretics. And so Urban, who's trying to hold Europe together in the midst of the 30-Year War and the plague, needs to show that he can stay in power, and was kind of looking for a convenient heretic to throw under the bus. And a little bit of a speculation, but perhaps Galileo was that convenient heretic. And it wasn't really about, and candidly, Galileo kept creating more and more problems for the Pope, and I think it was really sort of the sacrificial victim. But the irony is that while Galileo, who ultimately recanted his Copernican beliefs, was sentenced to house arrest, he actually wrote the book that the Pope wanted him to write all the way back to the early 1600s, called Two New Sciences, which remains his primary contribution to science. And we're going to move next page. So to just kind of wrap this up, we have what we call the three faces of Urban. There were really three periods, and at the bottom, I don't think you can read it because of our heads, it says, Urban to Galileo, go away, I've got bigger fish to fry. And if you flip to the next page, we're just going to give you the three faces of Urban VIII, and it's Urban 1.0 as the cardinal from 1610 to 1633. Galileo, one of Galileo's best friends, his protector, his supporter, also very interested in the arts and in science. And by 1623, when he was elected Pope, the dynamics changed. Obviously, he's now Pope, but he was still protecting Galileo during this period. And when Urban was named Pope, it was called the Marvelous Conjuncture, having to do with the arts and sciences, and he actually convened what were called the Barberini Bees, 500 of the most talented artists, scientists, poets, and they rebranded Rome in the midst of the 30 Years' War. And that included people like Bernini with all the fountains. But by 1632, there was one particular battle that turned the tide of the war. The Swedish, who were Lutheran, had made an alliance with the Catholic French, and everything started to change. And this is where Urban found himself up against the wall. And at that point, he becomes Galileo's nemesis because Galileo is really creating problems, was very conveniently available to show his reassertion of power. And Urban is trying to save the world and hold it all together, and Galileo keeps mucking it up with this whole issue of proposing Copernicanism, but with no proof. And so we have the situation, no proof, asking the Catholic Church to go forward and basically legitimize Copernicanism. And that's just another deconstruction. And so with sort of these three faces of Urban who evolved over time, these characters who we'll talk about a little bit, and then just understanding, I don't think it was simply a matter of science versus religion. It opens up a different kind of dialogue, which is not to be an apologist for Urban, but to simply put it in a different light. So that's the 5-minute version of the deconstruction of Galileo, hopefully not too confusing.
So, first of all, how many people here, and I know that you'll be able to see each other, how many people here heard something that they never heard in 6th grade? Right? You know? Something about the story that we heard growing up and that we hear even today in some ways that, yikes, I wish I would have known that. That surely makes things a little different. So I want to start with Jacob. One of the things that Craig said was that the Tychonian system really was a reasonable compromise, that there were these three. And I'm curious, one, if you could give us a little bit more on the Tychonian system, and then kind of your speculation on why Galileo chose to be so obnoxious about that.
Yeah, of course. So I guess to start, I'll talk a little bit about what the original model was, which was Ptolemy's model. And this is obviously the very simple model, but you really can't fault the Greeks and other people for thinking this. You go outside, you watch the sun rise, you watch the sun set, looks like it's going around the Earth. You watch the moon, looks like it's going around the Earth. If you watch the stars, if you're camping at night, you can see one constellation rise, and very slowly, the stars look like they're going around the Earth. So, on one hand, it's not really that unreasonable to think that maybe the Earth is at the center and everything's going around it. And so the Greeks had this model. You had the sun at the center. You figured out relative distances for the moon and the sun, the Earth at the center, relative distances for the moon and the sun, various planets, and at the very outer realm you have the stars, and then beyond that you have the ether. Maybe that's heaven, maybe something like that. A couple different interpretations, and that was the standard model until Copernicus being one of the alternatives, saying, well, maybe everything goes around the sun. Maybe the Earth is not at the center. Maybe the sun is at the center. Earth goes around the sun. The moon maybe still goes around the Earth, but all the other planets go around the sun too. Much more closer to what we think about today. Technically, they still put it at the center of the universe. We know today we're not at the center of the universe at all. We'll ignore that for now.
Heretic, you heretic.
That's right. So one of the reasons that Copernicus liked this idea, and then I'll get to the Tychonic system, is if you follow the motion of the planets, so like I just said, the stars look like they're going around the Earth. But if you follow the motion of the planets, you might notice some weird things. And Babylonian astronomers tried doing this, astronomers since then. So I'll use Mars as an example. Mars, if you watch it for a while, it looks like it's going around Earth, but the planets change position on a day-to-day basis. The stars don't, but since the planets are moving just like Earth, if you look at the planets on a week-to-week basis, month-to-month, they're going to be in a different position in the sky. And so that's fine. They could still be going around the sun or the Earth. But with Mars, you watch it move along the sky, and then it stops, and it goes back, and then it keeps going, and then it goes back. And we call that retrograde motion. And that's really difficult to explain if everything's going around the Earth. It's a lot easier if everything's going around the sun, because we're orbiting the sun, Mars is orbiting the sun. There's going to be some points where Mars looks like it's going the other way. So the old system tried to do this. There's ways of fixing the orbits. You have a circle, orbiting a circle, orbiting a circle. It's really complicated. So the solution to Ptolemy's model was really bad, really complicated. But like we just said, there's not necessarily observational preference for Copernicus. So the compromise model that a guy named Tycho Brahe invented was, well, what if we say that you do have the Earth going around the sun, maybe you do have the moon going around the Earth, or the moon going around both of those, but now you have all the rest of the planets going around the Earth still, or that Earth-Sun system. And so it's kind of a hybrid model where you still maintain the Earth at the center, but other planets can still be orbiting around the whole system. And so you solve the problem of retrograde motion. You solve the other anomalies that the planets were causing. And at the time that Galileo was doing his observations, there was no preference in terms of what you could observe in space. You really couldn't distinguish between these two models at all. And in fact, I'm getting a little long-winded, but there were possibly some reasons to prefer Tycho's model to Copernicus's model at the time of Galileo. But the best case, if you're going to give Galileo the benefit of the doubt, he had a really good conjecture. Maybe the reason he preferred that was because it was simpler. We have a philosophical tool called Occam's razor we like, which is, all things being equal, the simpler solution's the best. That's not a logical tool, it's just sort of an idea. But Copernicanism is a lot simpler than Tycho's model, which has two different patterns of circles. But strictly speaking, you couldn't prefer one of them or the other based on the science of the day.
So at that moment in time, with all the complexities that Craig's talking about, there's no actual proof, but the political, social, and ethical consequences for the Pope, the world at the time, seem pretty serious. So it's not crazy for the Pope to actually not prefer Galileo's opinion.
That's right. The way I see it is, the church, I think it's wrong to think that the church is out trying to get science. I think that's completely the wrong narrative. There was a lot of science the church accepted at the time, but I think the church they're also not a scientific institute. And so the church's main goal was not to further the cause of science. The church's goal is what the church does, serve God and create worship. And the Catholic Church at the time had a lot of political agenda as well. But there were two motives then. One, we want to have the best science of the day, and two, we want to make sure we're consistent with the best theology of the day. And so if you've got your theology nailed down, and it says there's a lot of theological reason to prefer the Earth at the center, and you've got two models that are observationally indistinguishable, you're going to prefer the one that supports your theology.
Great. That actually leads perfect to Douglas. Probably in this room, the person who spends the most time thinking about the relationship of science and religion is Douglas. And I'm curious, given that that I think that you might suggest, or you know, in our conversations, that you can't have actually an inherent contradiction between scientific truth and religious truth. What was it first that made the Galilean view so challenging to the church? And then what's interesting is within 150 years, it turns out that Galileo is correct. And the church then is able to, quotation marks, reinterpret. So two questions. One is, what was so problematic from a theological perspective then? And what is it that allowed the church to reframe or reinterpret Scripture? Because clearly there was no contradiction at the core between Scripture, or Scripture doesn't impose the science.
So this is the question for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
First round. First round.
Good luck.
In terms of my sense of the theologians that the church has produced over a couple of millennia, my favorite theologian, and I think ultimately the most insightful of them all, is St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, did teach that principle, that there can be no disjunction or contradiction between a true science and the faith of the church. He worked with the best cosmology of his day, namely Aristotle's philosophy. The early medieval universities were built upon the thought, the philosophy of Aristotle as the secular philosophic basis of all of the work that they were doing in theology and all other areas of science as well. And so Aquinas' project was to square Aristotelian, the received cosmology and philosophy of his day, with the doctrines of the church. Some people thought it could not be done. He insisted that it is possible to do science, or what we would call science, in a rational way. He also insisted, and I think this is one of his greatest virtues, that theology aims at truth. And since he affirmed that science or philosophy aims at truth, and theology also is a very serious discipline that aims at truth. And so therefore, since we have these broad fields of study, both of which aim at truth, there must be a way of coordinating these two disciplines so that both disciplines can say what they have to say and be respected. And here I mean publicly respected, and not just simply be the private opinions of private scholars or people who are not in the public realm. And Aquinas accepted that challenge, and he fulfilled the assignment with absolute total brilliance. In the Islamic world, the person who occupies a similar kind of influential position in Islamic theology, Al-Ghazali is his name. He was faced with a similar dilemma. The Muslims, as you probably know, were in dialogue with Christians and with Jews in Spain at that time. The Muslims had a type of theology which they called kalam, and so these were some of the currents that were working or active at that time. Al-Ghazali in his final works, decided that he made the judgment that reason can be dispensed with as far as theological science or theology is concerned. And that particular opinion of his that was taken up and became the position in the Islamic community, and that discipline, that way of thinking called kalam, disappeared from the Islamic tradition, and the tradition continued as best it could without using reason or rationality in order to examine and judge, make comments on theological claims. The West came much more close to that than we possibly know. It was a very active discussion at the time. It wasn't necessarily given that St. Thomas's theology would prevail, but it did prevail in the West. And my point of view is thank God. Thank God. If his point of view had not prevailed, we would not have theologies that aim at truth, that claim to be somehow empirically based and based in reason. We would have severed our religious faith from these rational resources. So he's a very great man. He, I think, is one of the most important people in all of history, certainly in terms of our civilization.
Well, the contradiction between Galileo and, given that there was the burden of proof was not there yet, just reflect for a second, for a minute on what was the challenge theologically between science and faith that Galileo presented, which, you know, within the last 30, 40 years, the church has taken a different position.
The challenge that he faced is actually the same challenge that we're facing.
Great.
We have a new worldview. The received worldview for approximately 400 years is the Newtonian worldview. We probably, many of us know, or many of you may know, that Newton was a profoundly religious person. He was at Cambridge University. He wrote, if anything, more in the field of theology than he did in physics and mathematics. He believed very much that the proper interpretation of Newtonian science was to show that God is actual, and he did his work in order to, in part, show forth the glory of God and the sovereignty of God. When the French philosophers got hold of this in a later century, this interpretation or self-understanding that Newton had of his own enterprise was subverted or was reinterpreted into French materialism and atheism. So this has been a cultural influence with us. So partly the narrative that we have of the animosity between science and religion comes from this reinterpretation of what Newton was doing. But there's one key factor here that is alive still for us, and that is worldview, cosmologies. Philosophic research can make a very strong issue that the most powerful thoughts that are present in our minds are, for most people, the things that we never even think about because they're just so much the common sense. We're not even aware of the presuppositions that we make. And but it's been shown, or one sees through the history of philosophy, that a people's worldview is the single most important key that is used for interpreting events. And you know, I could say more about this, but I can't talk forever. What happened with this particular conflict is the medieval philosophy and science of Aristotle that had held sway in the European universities was challenged by this new way of thinking. the Aristotelian philosophy, the cosmology, that was the ground of all the work that was being done in the universities throughout Europe, was being challenged and perhaps subverted by these new ways of thinking about things.
And so it was not. It's not surprising, given that this new worldview that was subverting, the response to it, one, you wouldn't be able to reinterpret so quickly, and second, the burden of proof would have to be so significant before it was accepted. And I think that leads to you, Douglas. There are real costs when a worldview is held, or a dominant narrative is held, that turns out not to be right. There's real costs, and so I'm curious if you can reflect a little bit on those costs of holding on to this narrative, or
Sure.
the impact of it over the years, all the way till now.
Well, I think it might be helpful even to think about what the costs were that the actual parties involved in the Galileo affair were thinking about. Because nobody, when we look at the history, even though this has now been received as science dethrones religion, nobody thought that was going to happen. The fear was not that if Galileo's right, then there is no God and everything. Galileo was a faithful Catholic. Everyone involved was a faithful Catholic. Everyone was planning to continue being a faithful Catholic after they got finished resolving the issue at the time. The issue, in some sense, was not just a burden of proof question, but a burden of complexity question. Because one of the challenges was going to be, and one of the things that concerned the theologians, was that if the Copernican system turned out to not just be hypothetically a better model for predicting the movement of the planets, but actually true, then significant elements of Scripture needed to be reinterpreted. Not significant elements of Scripture were false, but rather they needed to be reinterpreted, because there wasn't really what we now take as sort of the debate between, maybe a more figurative or a more literalist interpretation of Scripture wasn't really the governing debate at the time. So people were ready to deploy new interpretational methodologies if they needed to. But the complexity was going to wind up somewhere. Either you were going to have Ptolemaic cycles that are tremendously hard to calculate, or you're going to have the slightly more complicated Tychonian system, or you get this very simple Copernican system, and then you get this massive interpretational edifice to help you make sense of Scripture, which is actually what we have now, right? Because now we realize, well, that's actually what we needed. But at the time, I think, recognizing that complexity, that cost of complexity was going to be borne somewhere, it's easier to see that it wasn't immediately obvious that it should be borne on the scriptural interpretation side rather than on the science side. And, carrying this forward now, when very much, the Galileo story, you've mentioned we all learned it in 6th grade. Well, why did we learn it? Not because Galileo is hugely important as a historical matter. We learned it in order to learn about the scientific method. We have this completely apocryphal story about the bowling balls off the Tower of Pisa in order to learn about the scientific method. That's why we have the legend about the apple falling on Newton's head. All of these are to help enculturate us, to help form us in a way that is not all that different, honestly, than religious formation,
Right.
as people who can accept science.
To do one more thing on this, and that is that these narratives, they accomplish real jobs. So the first job that you're suggesting the teaching of this narrative is to teach us the scientific method, see?
And to give us a version of it that's simple enough to grasp.
Right. What's missing when we teach that in 6th grade?
Well, I think what's missing is...
And I don't mean the facts of the story.
Right. No, I think what's missing from that deploying, the Galileo story to get across the scientific method that way, what's missing is that truth is complex. What's missing is that we don't really, and I think certainly practicing scientists know this, philosophers of science know this, we don't really start out so cleanly with a hypothesis and then we construct an experiment and then we either verify or falsify the hypothesis. that's helpful for us to understand why we can rely on it later, but in the actual point of carrying it out,
In the heat of the battle.
in the heat of the battle, everything is much more complicated and much less clear, and the clarity generally comes in hindsight, not looking forward. And so I think that's the main thing that goes missing in these myths, is that the clarity is a hindsight clarity,
That's great.
not a projection.
Can I just inject? I mean, I think this is clearly one of the cases of a paradigm shift. And through paradigm shift, and I don't know that we have to get too involved. I think people have a pretty good intuition. But the classic paradigm shifts occur when there are enough anomalies that the traditional model of describing reality no longer holds together. And I guess the question is, what impact does that have, and how do you relate that to what's going on today with, we have a number of paradigm shifts that we're in the midst of. But, particularly, I'm going to throw it over to Douglas, because I know you and I talked a bit about the whole Thomas Kuhnian interpretation of
Thomas Kuhn
crisis.
is the main figure. I think you're absolutely right about that, and we are in a paradigm shift. I would like to give one example of that, which I think is important for all of us. Albert Einstein published the special theory of relativity in 1905, and it was there that he made the affirmation that E equals mc squared. I won't bother to explain it, but we've all heard of that formula. It's the most famous formula of them all. It's actually not even that hard to prove once you've discovered it and know what you're doing it. I'm teaching a class in quantum physics and theology, and a couple weeks ago I just very easily proved that formula up on the blackboard, and no one really blinked. It didn't take much more than high school algebra to do it. And a couple of postulates, assumptions, which are well rooted about the velocity of light. But what disturbs me, and actually the reason why I became a priest and not a scientist, not a physicist, is the moral dimension that of our lives. We won't talk about the election that we've just been through, but probably most of us, on however we voted, we see that there are real issues. This moral dimension of what kind of people we are and how it is that we're going to root our lives in terms of ethics and how we treat each other and our ultimate goals. Thomas Aquinas is absolutely brilliant on these things. He has so many profound insights into them that we tend not to read. It's not even funny. But we tend not to do that. And the thing that strikes me about Einstein in 1905 with his relativity theory in E equals mc squared is that within 40 years, the scientists and engineers learned how to convert that formula into an atom bomb and then drop it over two cities in Japan. Einstein said later, if I knew that this discovery was going to be used in this way, I never would have become a physicist. I would have become a watchmaker. He also said that since this bomb was dropped, everything has changed except the way we think. So we have these profound issues in our culture that it's only 40 years between the discovery of the science and the use of that science in order to destroy hundreds of thousands of human beings.
Douglas, it seems to me as I'm listening, then right now we have a problem running in two directions. And in America, for sure, two directions at least. And that is that one, for increasing number of Americans, in fact, the largest, fastest growing demographic in America is none, N-O-N-E, religiously. And as Catholics, you know the hemorrhaging in the Catholic Church in terms of attachment and belonging and believing. As a rabbi, we have the exact same sort of hemorrhaging. It's happening across religious communities in America. There's something about, and using the Einstein toward nuclear weapons, there's something about what religion is able to offer now that is not compelling enough relative to the science. And that's on one hand. And then on the other hand, and this is more to you, is that there's something about science that in the way we teach it, and you're most concerned about that, there's something about the way we teach science that is disconnected from what we're calling here a sort of moral underpinnings. And that, of course, is the cost of missing out on the complexity, which is exactly what Sam is saying. So if maybe everybody could take 1 minute or 2 minutes on that, and then from your perspective, how do we do better in the education of science so that actually there's a moral underpinnings? And from your perspective, how do we do better in theology or in religion so that it actually plays any role in the way people are increasing numbers of people are conceptualizing their lives? And then, Sam, I want you to reflect on whatever they say.
So first of all, I'm very sympathetic to your motives for choosing to choose religion versus science as a career choice. That's part of the reason, as when I finished my PhD program, I did a postdoc in ethics, because I felt that the moral dimension is very important. And one of the things I noticed is you could take any issue. Climate is something I focus on in my own work, climate change. But any issue, biomedical, any of these controversial science topics, there are moral dimensions to them. There's very strong moral dimensions to them. And most scientists are, I was going to say afraid, but that might even be the wrong word, because I think a lot of scientists are discouraged, possibly from the way the academy is structured. It certainly doesn't help your career if you're trying to be a tenure track professor to go out and give your opinion about climate change and what we should do and how that might translate to policies or how you should vote. That's very unpopular. That could actually hurt your career, especially if you work for NASA or an Ivy League school or something like that. That could be really, really dangerous. But then that leaves this big vacuum where there's all this knowledge coming in, and there's no way to interpret that morally. How do we make sense of, and studying ethics, I learned there's actually a lot of really great tools for how we conceptualize ethics. You can do this in a religious framework in theology, but you can be a complete atheist and have a really good ethical framework for trying to interpret this science. And so personally, that's where I'm trying to go now, is how do you bridge the gap? I try to talk to philosophers in ethics and do collaborations. There's still a lot of pushback from scientists. There's a lot of pushback from philosophers. A lot of philosophers don't want to collaborate with scientists. But I think that's what we need to do, is have interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary conversations to really unpack. In some ways, we've done so much science, and we need to step back, bridge the gap, connect the web a little bit, and talk to other disciplines to really see what this means.
Great. So there's real reasons. I think what we're going to have conversations about, there are real reasons why there's pushback against scientists doing ethics. In fact, you have to go and study a complete other discipline. And you made a comment that when scientists actually begin to take positions in the ethical domain, it's not always safe for them to do that, whether that's job, whether that's tenure. So there are real reasons why there is this split from the science perspective. Now I'm interested, Douglas, in the religion perspective, because clearly religion's not working in helping many, many people think about the moral dimensions of science. So if you can reflect on that.
Well, I think,
Mike.
I think we've tended to abandon the chief metric for good theology. Theology, like any other science, aims at truth. And truth, if it is genuine truth, can be articulated rationally and empirically and coherently and persuasively. You will believe theological propositions not because of your particular denomination, which just magically happens to articulate exactly what you believe. Oh, heavens, how does that happen? But you need the metric of truth. And that's an issue. That's a very major issue. What we need is so I'm suggesting that in our own way, we're in the same boat.
Right.
But we may not have as much time as Europe had in order to work these things out. What we need is a way of understanding the world that has a concept of God that is just as sensible and articulate and well-founded as our science appears to be. Now, that's a big challenge, but that's what I've been working on for a long time. And if you can do that and root the theology and root the science in a coordinated way, look, they do different things. They have different emphases, but you can link the two as in a way that's called a coin. Probably coin's not a very widely used English word, Q-U-O-I-N, and a coin is when you build a building and the corners and the stones linking the corners absolutely fit together as one piece. That's what we need. We need a vision of the world in which the scientific understanding, the contemporary one, lines up exactly with the moral and the human dimensions. And that's what we don't have at this point, and we need to work on this.
Great. So I'm struck by how we have the scientist being able to do a critique of, let's call it for right now, the science establishment, for a whole variety of reasons that we'll need to explore, not being able to jump into or engage in the really, really difficult ethical studies. And I'm struck, Douglas, that you're willing to, not willing, but that you're saying in a very serious way that theology is not done it's not done with a respect for real metrics of truth by so many theologians, and that makes it very, very, very difficult for people to say, yes, wow, I never thought of it that way. And now I want you to reflect on, given that you're one of the people who really does think about, and maybe it's your Jesuit background, maybe it's, and your journalist background, and you think about the future. You really think about how this affects the political and economic and social consequences, not just of your Catholic community, okay? Because more than just Catholics read your publication. And so I'm struck about your reflection.
You know, I think that I was saying to the panelists that I am certainly the least qualified among us from any kind of standard of expertise in the particular subjects that we deal with, but what I do have is the experience of spending a significant amount of time dealing with the way people talk about these things in the contemporary world and seeing the comments and the exchanges back and forth where the word Galileo is deployed almost as a shibboleth that means now religion has to go sit in the corner and, you know, with a dunce cap on and not bother the rest of us, or something like that. Which is a very dogmatic position, actually. Kind of funny.
Yeah.
I think, you know, to go back to, Craig, the demonstration you did with the hammer and the feather, and, you know, all of us, if we remember our 6th grade science, know how that's supposed to work. But the reason it doesn't work, of course, is because there's all these other complications from the air resistance, et cetera, et cetera. And to get to the pure model where you can explain it cleanly and actually have it teach you what it's supposed to teach you about the way gravity works and what gravity is, you need to factor out all those other complexities to be able to look at it in this reduced, simplified model. I think that's a big part of the reason why many scientists don't want to grapple with the ethical questions and the complicated philosophical questions. And of course, you can't pin philosophers down on which ethical or meta-ethical system they're using. So that's not going to lead to any great methodological clarity. Try to get a bunch of theologians to debate about which metric of truth to use, and we'll still be here 10 years from now with a pile of footnotes up to our ears, but probably not have moved immediately closer to an answer. So those complexities are, I think the question is whether or not we have a frame of conversation and a frame of communication in which those complexities are treated as opportunities or as burdens. Great. And generally, I think this has only gotten more true as communication has gotten faster and faster and faster, and we tend to want the answer before we have the question. Oftentimes, you see this now. One of the tropes in contemporary digital journalism is the day after something happens, were all reporting on what Google searches ramped up at that time, right? So, or, you know, the day after the election, it was like, did you know that the Canadian immigration website crashed? But I think, that was a big story that day. I think a lot of that has to do with wanting the answer almost before we formulated the question. So, and we're expecting that we can just, you know, we can type into Google and someone will have already answered it for us. And the problem we're running into is, well, no, we're the ones who are actually going to have to build the answer, and we haven't done it yet. So I think we can understand kind of very, very natural human impulses to want to pull all that complexity out of the problem so that we can just get an answer. And I think one of the roles that I hope religion can play is to give people a holistic framework within which to take that complexity and say, there's an opportunity here, not just a burden. The complexity is not our enemy.
I just want to throw out the idea, and it's a little bit different, but I think there might be some interesting policy implications. Right now, one of the biggest debates that we have in education is, well, it's not even a debate, a focus on STEM. And what we're starting to see is a very serious movement about injecting the arts into, so it moves from STEM to STEAM. And I guess my question would be, it's a little bit different with theology and science, but the need for art is to sort of open the mind. And theology, I mean, intuition and spiritual experiences, is there any connection from a policy standpoint that we can learn from, you call it the coin, which is the full integration, as opposed to we're going to get a lot more creativity and a lot more innovation, a lot more inventions if we inject arts into STEM. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to comment on, but
I can comment on that. I think you're quite right. Art is probably the fundamental element that led to the Neolithic Revolution and sent us on our way as far as a civilization is concerned. To create artifacts and tell stories is just so significant for the human development. Einstein used to say that creativity is more important than knowledge, and that's really true. It sounds like, it's a great line. It also happens to really be the truth as well. It's really important. And so we're going to need imagination. One of the things with this way in which we're telling the story of Galileo and the church is, first of all, with the paper that we read, I was a bit troubled by it because it talks about cause and it talks about wars and it talks about political parties, and I'm thinking, God, where's God in this narrative? Holy Spirit, where's Holy Spirit in this narrative? Jesus and his significance as Savior of the world, where is he in this narrative? And you don't find it there, and you think, what's going on here? And so we need some kind of a narrative that brings in these dimensions of religion that are foundational to religion and begin coordinating them with our own lives and with our science and our art and everything else.
Yeah, the tools that we're going to need, I mean, I think that what we're all in some way hedging around is we're going to need a lot of tools that help us delight in complexity. And we don't have those tools, and we don't have the communication tools, and Douglas, that's what you're saying. We don't have the communication tools right now. The language that you've just used will not be accessible to many, many Americans and increasing number of Catholics. And so how to translate that into an accessible idiom is a real job. So it's not only figuring out what's going on, but then both the communication and the tools for delight in curiosity, delight in complexity. I wrote a book called Embracing the Sacred Messiness of Life. But sacred messiness, those things don't go together. Everybody wants it so So neat. I guess I want to finish with one question for everybody, and then we'll open it up. And but it's rapid fire. It's rapid fire. Okay. And the question is if you could tell one character in the story one piece of advice, what would it be? So you have all the characters. Maybe we can even put those characters up again. It was, I think, the second or third slide. But if you can tell, or at least the principals, the protagonist, whatever, if you could be your favorite character, the character you want to say something positive to, negative to, one piece of counsel or advice. And maybe, Craig, you can go first because you know them thinking about the story. One character, one piece of advice. Hey, Pope Urban. Or...
Well, I'll start with Galileo. It is viewed that Galileo, many of his problems were self-inflicted by his arrogance.
So you would tell him?
I would say there's this thing called humility.
Good, beautiful.
And
excellent.
well, okay,
yeah,
and that
good, perfect. We're getting go. Perfect. So we'll get to that. That's perfect. Go.
Well, I think that would really...
Galileo, there's this thing called humility.
And the Pope was in a slightly different position because of the fallibility. And I think I would have said, just remember, because Aristotle, as a scientist, had a lot kind of wrong, but it was part of a process. And
Good.
This is the standing on the shoulder of giants, which...
The
when Newton came
humility process to Galileo. Who wants to go first here? You can pick any character.
So I'm going to pick Bellarmine because he's
Good.
the Jesuit. And I think I would say to Bellarmine, spend at least as much time working on helping the Pope understand what's complex about the interpretation of Scripture as trying to get Galileo to make his contributions hypothetical.
Beautiful. Wow. Douglas? That's great.
Mine would come with...
Put your mic.
Mine would come with a little story, and it would be Galileo and my advice to him. I would love to show him what we saw earlier with that demonstration of the astronaut on the moon, that the feather and the hammer really do hit the ground at exactly the same time. Too bad that Galileo didn't have that clip available to him to show the Pope. I wish that could be. But I would say, Galileo, you started a way of thinking and followed out methods that have created the whole of the modern world. And that Aristotelian philosophy that once held sway, it's now a subject for undergraduates and specialists in their own field. We know we don't live in that kind of world, and you made that world possible. You brought it into being. Stick by your guns, sir.
Wow, beautiful.
So I was going to make a similar point about humility and maybe don't antagonize the Pope. And whoever said it, I completely agree that scientists today could learn a lesson or two about humility. I guess to extend that, if I could go back in time and tell Galileo what we know now, I didn't mention this earlier, but there was one piece of specious, incorrect information that Galileo argued for that really hurt his argument, and that was he took the telescope, he looked at stars, and you see a little disk, and he measured that and said, that's the size of the star. Well, that's completely wrong. Like, you can do this. You can take your binoculars, you'll see a disk, but that just has to do with the physics of how light interacts as it travels through space and it goes through the atmosphere. So he measured the wrong size of the stars and then argued vehemently that this was evidence for Copernicanism. And so I would tell him, like, you've got some things right, but you can back off on other things. Like, this is not how the telescope works, and if you back off, you're going to have better science.
That's great. Wonderful, everybody. Let's open it up. It's hard for us to see, so I don't know if we want to maybe put up the light.
May I make a comment?
Yes, please.
The talk tonight seems to be about the dispute between science and religion, but I don't see science and religion as being in conflict at all. I'm sure if you went to a scientist's convention from the weekend, they'd be up drinking and passionately arguing, calling each other jerks, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and theologians would do the same thing, and this is very healthy. The problem is that science and religion play volleyball against each other, which is very healthy. But in between there is this
So, okay. Okay, so it turns out that that also was a dominant narrative, and I think that what you heard here was a little put, it doesn't seem like that's getting us anywhere, that take right now, even though I think it's the dominant take. No, here's, I think what you heard, which is really interesting. You had a scientist say, no, actually, there's some real issues regarding how science can integrate some of what we imagine is religion's job, the ethical, the intuitive, right, the emotional. We heard Douglas, who is a theologian slash scientist, say, actually, both are seeking after the truth, and the theologian is the one that said to Galileo, keep trusting yourself. You did it. You were right. He rah-rahed Galileo. That's the the theologian, right? And then you had Sam suggest that actually, if we could embrace not clarity as politics is the problem, that's so clear that actually if we embraced complexity, we would maybe be able to communicate, to be able to communicate in a little bit of a different way.
The problem tonight is that you don't have anyone representing the Habsburgs or the French monarchy.
Yes. That's fair. That's fair. It would be interesting. I think Craig invited us to at least identify with those sides. But yes, that's fair.
American Heritage Center and you have the Sierra Club here, then we would have.
That's true. That's the next. So now, Bill, we have the next program. Okay, we'll talk about Galileo in relation to the Sierra Club and American Heritage. Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Well, we're.
That's the world we live in. I'm sure that if Galileo and the Irwin had been arguing this out in Cambridge or Salamanca, I'm sure no one would have died. No one would have turned blind and ended up in a prison. I'm sure.
Well, that's I think what Craig was saying too.
I was actually going to suggest that maybe it's not a way out of this, it's not an answer, but to further complexify it, I think that maybe one of the things we need to do is to take a page from Aristotle again about what politics actually is. Because we've accepted, I think, as one of these dominant narratives, politics as this zero-sum war of all against all, when actually, at least in the the traditional medieval synthesis that comes from Aristotle, politics is the science of living together, right? It's the science of governing ourselves in a structured community, and it is a high vocation. And we've accepted a form of politics that is, little better than blood sport. But there is actually a better kind of politics out there, and I think the answer to the bad politics is not necessarily, pick the right side, but for the people who are called to it, and the people who can see the need for it, to actually live up to the higher vocation of politics.
Nice. Anybody else? Out loud though, because it's hard to. Oh, microphone. That's great.
I think, kind of bringing it back to today again, when we talk about that both sides really are questing for the truth, right? And what do we do? It seems like today the truth doesn't seem to matter. And when you stop caring or seeking for the truth, you become lost. I think it creates more conflict that's not healthy, right? Because I think that's, to me, one of the most horrifying things about what we recently saw in at least our own country, but it's happening in many places. And it's really not a religious thing or a science thing, but finding the truth again. Like, how do we get back to that's not a bad thing?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a breakdown when you move from facts to what I call ficts, F-I-C-T, where it just, we can look at either side. Basically, you end up with a breakdown in trust. And I think that's really, if you look at sort of how all institutions right now, whether it's the press, whether it's Congress, people don't, it almost at this point, people don't trust anything anyway. So the real question is you're sort of going, you're working down market. So we really have to figure out how to rebuild trust.
Yeah, you first, and then.
Well, I was actually going to reference a question you asked in your final reaction. Where is God? Where is the Holy Spirit? Where is some force larger than ourselves in this? And I think that as people of faith, it might lead us to ask the question not when do we have truth, but rather how do we participate in it? That the truth we're actually, since truth comes from God and leads us to God, it's larger than the structures we use to describe it, and it's larger than any of the various methodologies that we use to try to pin it down. And so if we're looking at it as truth is something we can possess in order to say we're right and the other side is wrong, then we're always going to be trapped there. But if truth is instead something we participate in, then the challenge becomes how do we help others who we disagree with participate in that truth with us? How do we participate in it together?
I could actually say something on that. So I actually think that applies very well to science as well. So in science, I think to address your question, there's almost a little bit of a disservice in scientists to try to be genuine in the sense of saying we're not coming up with truth. Because I think in a philosophical sense, scientists are asymptotically approaching the truth. You're trying to get there, but if we hit upon gravity exactly as it's embedded in the fabric of the universe, we actually could never prove that. So all we really have in science, we've just got a set of best guesses, and these are our best set of hypotheses. They work really well. They fit all the evidence to date. But when another idea, another piece of evidence comes along, as scientists, we're okay taking one of those revered ideas and discarding it for a better one. But that's very problematic if you're looking at science as a lens for getting the truth, absolutely, because you can be very, that can be very discouraging because science is always changing, and you're like, well, the scientist said this 1 year, now 10 years later they're saying this, and that's the way science works. That's good. That means science is doing its thing. But you're approaching the truth, you're participating in the truth. I really like that phrase, but you're not getting the truth, end of story, there it is on the table.
Buckminster Fuller had a great quote about gravity. He says, we know everything there is to know about gravity except why it exists.
Oh, I was going to say, following up on the element of participation, it's one of the more important concepts that we use as thinking human beings. The original term that entered into our culture is metake, which is classical Greek. It means participation. And when Plato was asked, well, how is it that the forms participate or influence the actualities? And he said, the young Socrates in the Parmenides says, well, the best I can make of it is participation. And participation is the key. What are we to do when we live in a world that in so many ways is discouraging? We can learn from St. Paul. St. Paul in 1 Thessalonians is working with a congregation necessarily small that is thinking that the world's going to end pretty soon, and all kinds of horrible things are going about. And many people in that congregation are saying, well, we know Jesus is coming back. When's he going to come back? And they focused on that. And Paul, in his pastoral advice to them, said, look, the really important thing is what kind of a person are you going to be? And that is how we participate in the establishment of a more fair, more just, more sane, more rational, more kind, more loving world. We become those kinds of people through the choices that we make and by the possibilities that we say yes to. We participate. And in this participating, this is our participation in the life of God. And this is what the church does. And this is what we do as Christian people working in the larger society.
Any other? Yeah, let's see over there.
Hi, I was struck when you asked the question, I think you used the word hemorrhaging, that in Jewish faith and Catholicism, all believers, well, losing members, people not continuing. And I kind of came up with the answer also in relation to this talk about Galileo. You titled it Deconstructing, which is a postmodern term. And nowhere in this conversation have you talked about power in the Foucault sense of the word. And I think there's a lot of elements to the story that would be explained by that. So I was wondering what you
It was
have
just
to say.
a choice of how much we can put in one. And I mean, I think you heard clearly that these narratives don't become dominant for no reason. They have, real resonance, and there are real arrangements that ensure them. Whether those arrangements are, people don't get tenure if they don't publish the right things, or if they move into fields that they don't. So, it's as you know, Foucault says, we think that knowledge is power, but what Foucault taught is power is knowledge. And amongst the many things that we're going to have to address will be that. It was just one more, it's an important question.
The answer to the question, though, to the question that you posed, the way I understand it is you had, to get more historical, you had the center of all power was the church or the predominant religions. And people through, the story that we learned with Galileo, and the reason it reverberates is we moved away from an institution having power over us to the individual having power over us. So the reason people are more rejecting, for example, women don't need to ask the priest about how they should determine their, what they do with their bodies, for example. And that's part of the reason why I think your hemorrhaging is the word that you used.
Yeah, well, it happens to be that it's the liberal churches in America and liberal synagogues in America that are genuinely hemorrhaging. So it's a curious thing. It turns out those religious veins that are most liberal, which means they have most addressed internally the modern and postmodern categories, they're the ones that are hemorrhaging the most. And so it's fascinating that that's part of the split, that's part of the shift that we're in. Sam?
Can I just,
Yeah.
it's what, regarding the power dynamic, part of the title of the talk was also the cathedral and the bazaar. And what that was a reference was the redistribution of power away from our central organizations. It's a much longer conversation. We really just didn't have time to get into that. But I think it at least was part of it has to do with how we're really gaining knowledge and intuition on these difficult subjects.
And I just wanted to point out another one of those potential complexities that the narratives tend to simplify, because as someone who lives and works within the structures of the institutional church, the idea that the church is this center of all power that is being governed and exercised in any purely intentional way, whether malicious or benign, I don't really recognize. And I think when we look carefully at the history, what we find is that it's no more true to say that, Urban at the time was the center of all power than it has been over the last 8 years to say that Barack Obama has the center of all power. Because there are all sorts of other forces and actors resisting and compromising and undermining and doing things that are seeking other ends entirely, that have nothing whatsoever to do in a deliberate way with these particular issues. So I think whenever we look closer, we're going to find that yes, power is certainly an issue, and I think the insight of postmodernism and deconstruction at that level is completely valid, but it is very rarely, at least within the life of the church, which I can speak to with at least some knowledge, if not authority, that power is very rarely deployed in a planned, deliberate fashion. It's usually much more haphazard. And the clarity, as I said before, is hindsight clarity, not a plan going forward.
Yes, I think that I'm reminded of Flannery O'Connor's line, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make ye weird." I can be a baseball fan or a science fan, but if I'm a religion, I'm a fanatic, right? And I think that as well as science is being developed so beautifully, I mean, constantly being developed and developed, we stop developing the power of God. We treat God like he's a wimp God. When's the last time you said, take up your bed and walk? Or I saw God face to face. We've just left all that power out as if it's not working on it. Yeah. Let's work on the power that we have. And we just do it a little bit in prayer or a telephone call to a friend who's ill or something. But
It strikes me that one of the issues on that, and that's a great comment, is that, so I look at the way religious leadership functions in the country as one of the things that I do across, and I think we would have to be self-critical, those of us who take faith seriously and who conceptualize ourselves and live in actually a religious way, is that most religion right now, whether liberal or conservative, is for the most part politics and drag. And so that you tell me the person, the church, and the zip code, or the preacher, the minister, the pastor, the rabbi, you tell me the name of his church, you tell me the zip code, and I'll tell you what his theology is, or her theology is. And that's a very funky place to be for religious people, to always be anchoring and buttressing and legitimizing the existing political position, right? And I don't care if you're in opposition or you're in favor, whatever it is, of whatever the issue is. And that we're going to have to figure out what the value add-on in a really live metric way, in a way that is compelling. It's not going to be enough to be compelling in words. It's going to have to be compelling in the behaviors you just spoke about, the behaviors that Douglas, riffed on at the end of his riff.
We go back to use of power. I mean, the use of, are you going to make a bomb? Are you going to kill a baby? What are you going to do with your power? I mean, that's the first thing Jesus was brought through to temptation. How are you going to use your power? What are you going to be? And what are we going to be?
No, but also the scientists and the religious figures both have to exhibit bravery. They must be very courageous. Galileo was courageous. Now, I don't know whether he was courageous out of naivete
Or arrogance.
Well,
I doubt it. I'm sure he was just a regular, very brave, courageous person who had scientific knowledge, and we have a scientist there. And believe me, I work in medicine. When you have statistics and you know something is more likely, like statistically, way more likely right than not, and you've worked very, very hard at it, you're supposed to shut up and fit in and moderate it because you're afraid of tenure? No. You have to be brave. You have to speak out. The same in my church, the Catholic Church I go to for the last 25 years. Not one single priest has given a lecture on climate change. Not one. Never. Never told
Okay.
us what car to drive.
Right.
Never, ever told us. Ever. And that is an absolute disgrace.
Okay.
I've received regular sermons on abortion, on other issues, which I also are very important to me. But not to receive a single sermon on climate change in almost 30 years implies that the priests are afraid, that they're controlled, just like this scientist said, he's afraid.
Right.
He's
Right. So the question there, and I think it's beautiful how you did it both ways. The question would be, what are the environments that we can begin to create? I know his publication. I know what he's trying to do. I've spoken to Douglas, and I know what he's trying to do. Upper West Side. Yikes. Okay. So right. Right. Wow, that's amazing. How can you get away with that on the Upper West Side? I thought that was the cathedral of liberalism, the whole Upper West Side. But I think that we have to ask about ourselves. Part of it is you didn't hear any. I think one of the curious or interesting things you saw here is no one blames someone else. So we started with Craig, who said, I'm getting out of the blame game altogether. I'm going to give you a different context and a different sense of what this battle was about. Then you heard a scientist and a scientist educator. Most of what he said in terms of tone was self-critique of the field and self-critique, and then you heard from the theologian, scientist, right? And a far more humble take about what we need to do better. And I think that that's everybody, whether you're a member of a church or a member of a congregation or a synagogue. What is it that we could do to create safer environments? Because if our ministers and our priests and our rabbis and our imams are so unsafe, then who's left in the pews? The people who are making people unsafe? And we would have to ask that. We're the people making those people unsafe. I mean, yes, people should be more brave, but people can only be as brave as they are.
Well, one of the really poignant aspects of the Galileo story is really the recantation, where he, for whatever reason, this is one of my, for the next 20 years I'll be thinking about this one, but if you remember, there was another character, Giordano Bruno, who would fit the description of weird, but also was Copernican, was burned at the stake. And Galileo, given his health, given the work he wanted to continue to do, in the end, capitulated. And there's the apocryphal version, as he's walking out from the abjuration, he taps his foot on the floor and says, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. And there's pretty good reason, even if he didn't say it, he sure as heck was thinking that. But, how far do you go? How, do you sacrifice the whole thing, or do you make an assessment of sort of circumstances? And it really was a negotiated settlement at the end.
But that's a replay of compassion. Everybody has to make decisions
Yeah.
on the spot. Somebody tells you something. You have to make a decision. You're either brave or you're not.
Well, yes, but there's also the question, I think, of who do we think is keeping score, right? Who do we think is awarding Galileo whatever points are awarded, and what are the points? Well, right, but for saying, and still it moves. So I think this is a question that, and I don't have an answer to this. This is a question I struggle with, because it is sometimes vitally necessary to speak truth to power, whatever the consequences. But oftentimes that motive leads us to ignore the question or avoid or simply slip past the question, who's hearing us when we speak truth to power? Are we communicating to anyone when we do that? Now, I'm a Catholic priest. I believe in a church that, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. This is true. I'm not denying that there are times to speak truth to power, and that something comes of that in a way that we can't account for practically. But I think that comes in God's power. That comes when the Spirit moves, not when we decide that it's the right time to do it. So I hear the call for bravery, and I think it's necessary, but I also would say it's got to be a discerned bravery. It's got to be a bravery that is cooperating with the Spirit of God when the possibility is there.
When you're asked
So-
to be brave, it's not a round table discussion. You don't have 5 minutes.
No, the discernment comes from a lifetime of formation towards it.
Right. Right. So I think that is one of the many debates about how we do make decisions. And as you know, science is changing even how we think about making decisions.
I'd like to say
yeah, go.
something here. Quantum physics, how does the world really work? First of all, the unit of reality is not mass. It's not matter. The unit of reality is events. And when we think about events in our own terms, we know that for every event, there is a future, and there's a past, and then there is the becoming, the synthesis, the coming together of possibilities from the future and actualities from the past, and they're synthesized. In the older Newtonian world, which I find all too much in this literature that we use for preparing this discussion, the way things happen is you push stuff. Forces reign supreme. That models out the way in which action actually occurs. We know from our own direct experience, and now the science lines up with it very nice, is we discern possibilities. We think, we look, we discern possibilities, and we get to choose. We say yes or no to the possibilities. And that's the basic structure for human action. And if in fact we have been, for example, people who have been dedicated to following Christ and in that uncomfortable way, follow the way of the cross, which we find very useful because we don't always win every single ball game and people don't always treat us nice. So we learn about the way of the cross. We practice that for year after year, decade after decade, and it forms us. It forms our habits, it forms our souls, it forms our characters. And then when the day of crisis comes, we're armed and we're prepared and we can act. And we all do that more or less. But it's the work of the church and it's the work that we owe to ourselves to think about what kinds of people we're going to be, what are the ideals that we're going to follow, and who in our lives are our exemplars. For Christian people, Christ really is the Savior of the world. And if there is going to be an escape from nuclear war and the continuation of the human race, we're going to have to get over this habit of slaughtering each other and going to war against each other and learn how to talk with each other and reconcile and be kind to each other. And those elements are set forward by Jesus Christ and the Christian faith, not just by the Christian faith, but that's what we have and that's what we need to go with.
Bill.
Really extraordinary. Surely, we are only scratching the surface on this subject, Craig. You're so right about Galileo. And for those of you who are interested in our other interfaith program, His Eminence Timothy Cardinal Dolan will be here on December the 5th, along with Ambassador Ronald Lauder, the President of the World Jewish Congress. It's on December the 5th about the crisis of Christians in the Middle East. There's somebody here tonight that you really need to know. My commitment to interfaith dialogue at the Sheen Center is very strong. But a man who's done it for years, representing the Archdiocese, is Father Brian McWeeny, and his job is to bring people of all faiths together in great dialogue, and I'm so honored that he's here tonight, and much more that we're going to do. And again, gentlemen, thank you so much, and for those of you who've never been here on your way out, there's a lot going on at the Sheen Center. There's a catalog of great stuff that's taking place. And just lastly, I just want to say that upstairs, there's a book club going on tonight. You mentioned Flannery O'Connor. We're going to do some Flannery O'Connor in a month if you want to come back. It's in the brochure. But lots of great theater and music and film going on here. But lastly, I have no doubt that there's more time for Galileo and more time for you to come back. And thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Thank you.